I'm very pleased to have with me here Stephen Booth and Steve Pearce. Steve has very kindly agreed to shorten his name, so to avoid the confusion of the two Stephens. So thank you very much, Steve. And they're representing the policy side and also the academic side of the debate. So Stephen Booth became co-director of Open Europe in 2015. His research interests include justice and home affairs and the wider UK-EU relationship. While at Open Europe, he's written on EU regulation, justice and home affairs and EU aid policy. And he's going to talk about migration and security issues. And on my right is Steve Pearce. He's Professor of EU Law and Human Rights Law at the University of Essex. He co-wrote a commentary on EU immigration and asylum. And he's also written extensively on the EU Citizenship Director, and he's author of a forthcoming report on the legal consequences of British withdrawal from the EU or renegotiation of EU membership. And today he's going to talk about free movement and his impact.
Trying to answer the question which we're posed with, has the UK lost control of its borders? Because it's one of those questions you can't answer easily, to be honest. Sometimes you can say yes or no to a question. It's one of those questions you can only answer fully and properly if you give a slightly different answer to the question that was actually asked, and I'll explain why. And the why is that the assertion that we've lost control of our borders has a kernel of truth to it, but it would not be true to say that it's fully true. It's partly true. Why do I say that? Well, there's a simple reason why I say that, and I'll elaborate a little bit. The simple reason why I say that is that it is true to say that we don't have any real, genuine control over the numbers of EU citizens that come to this country. On the other hand, we do largely control the numbers of non-EU citizens that come to this country. And the mechanism by which we filter the EU from the non-EU citizens is by checking people at the borders, and in that sense, of course, at that point, at the borders, we can decide not to admit non-EU citizens. Or, in practice, what happens with immigration law is that the mere fact that we have a visa control deters people from applying to come if they don't think they'll get a visa, or we can turn down the visa application, and sometimes do as well. Or we can set conditions which are so difficult, for family members to join EU citizens, to join British citizens rather in Britain, that some of them won't bother. So that's what we do. We do have that significant degree of control over part of our immigration policy. And here I'm talking about immigration of all non-British citizens. There's a significant part of it which we don't really control. At the EU part, there's a significant part which we do largely control. And let me quantify those two categories in numbers, looking at the most recent immigration statistics which were produced in November, for the year going up to June. We had a net migration of 336,000, of which there's two different categories of figures, but the immigration figures, as distinct from long-term immigration, the immigration figures are that 180,000 net migrants came from the European Union, 201,000 net migrants came from outside the European Union. And so you can see that, in fact, slightly more than half of the immigration to this country was from outside the European Union. Slightly less than half is the EU migration, which we can't control. Slightly more than half is what we can control, largely can control. There's a little bit of a caveat, a couple of caveats to that. That's my overall conclusion, that yes, it's partly true to say we've lost control of our borders, but it's a distinction that has to be made between EU and non-EU citizens, and that distinction is made at the border. So in a way, the accurate thing to say, whether you take it as a criticism or not, the accurate thing to say about the EU and UK membership is that we cannot control the number of EU citizens who come to this country. That is accurate to say. It's inaccurate, misleading to translate that into saying that we've lost control of our borders, because, of course, that involves non-EU citizens as well, and the control takes place at the borders. So that clearly has an effect in terms of reducing the number of asylum seekers, for instance, who make it to the territory. So that would be my answer. As with so many of the claims that go back and forth on both sides in the debate, there is it's partly correct, to make that particular claim, but can only really be fully understood and properly assessed with a lot of caveats and further explanation. Thanks so much.
Well, I guess my answer to the question, well, the short answer to the question is very similar to Steve's, which is yes and no. So on the migration half of the question, clearly the free movement of EU citizens means a certain loss of control. But I think obviously we have to see this in the wider context. As sort of Steve set out, the government is nominally in control of non-EU migration, but it struggled to meet its target of reducing migration to the hundreds of thousands. And it struggled to meet it quite spectacularly. 200,000 non-EU migrants, as Steve outlined. And the truth is because it's difficult to meet these targets for reasons that are either out of government's control or they're undesirable to change. The UK's economic cycle is going to differ to that of our competitors or partners. The English language is something that we're not going to change. There's the pull of people who've already come here. Obviously the UK has been experiencing high levels of migration for quite a considerable time, and that has its own kind of gravitational pull. And obviously the needs of the economy, business, universities, you name it, and the government is clearly struggling to balance all those factors that elements of it can control, but obviously the elements that are out of its control. So I think if we can, as part of this referendum process, have a slightly more rational conversation about migration and understanding the limits of government action and the limits of what governments can reasonably be expected to control, I think that would also be a helpful part of the process in this campaign. One can argue that the UK has managed to retain a large degree of freedom despite its EU membership. We're not in Schengen. We have the choice whether to opt into EU migration or asylum policies when it comes to non-EU nationals. Yes, it's true that once someone from the outside of the EU gains national citizenship of another EU member state, they gain the right to come here. But in most other EU member states, that requires a significant degree of integration, such as perhaps learning a language or being there for a long period of time. And I think you would be right to wonder if you have taken the time to learn the language of another member state and integrate there, why would you then necessarily want to move again? And I think we can also argue that the migration crisis itself that we've witnessed over the last few years has actually illustrated how insulated the UK is from these obligations that other member states have, despite our membership. If we have if the referendum results in a leave vote, what will happen in both these areas? Obviously, I think Steve has outlined the issue of migration very well. There's clearly a huge trade-off between potential economic relationship we have in terms of access to EU markets and then what that means for accepting the free movement of people. The Swiss and Norwegian experience would suggest that if the UK sought to replicate its current access to the single market or even something very close to it, free movement is likely to be part of the deal. And we will see how the Swiss get on in their negotiations, because the Swiss government is in a position where it might have to unilaterally impose some restrictions on free movement if it can't get a deal with the European Commission in the next few months. The actual risk is that we may actually lose some of the things that are actually beneficial to us in terms of the Dublin arrangements and what attitude would France take to effectively policing our border on the other side of the Channel in Calais if we were to leave the European Union. What conclusions would they draw about that? I wonder. I also think that when it comes to migration and the migration crisis, I think one thing I would note is that actually, despite all the initial talk of the UK being isolated on this issue, the EU's response is becoming more and more British in the sense that actually people are starting to think, well, perhaps the Brits had a point. This is actually about trying to reduce the numbers coming. That means doing unpalatable things. It means strengthening the external border. It means reducing the flow of people. It means trying to address the problem at the source and trying to look at the camps nearby and boost resources for those people and if necessary, relocate the most vulnerable people where possible. On migration is clearly going to be a huge part of the campaign, and I think it's actually interesting that there seems to be a growing consensus actually that perhaps immigration policy might not change that much actually as a result of this referendum. That would be quite interesting to see. if that's how the campaign is fought, because I think there had been an assumption a long time that this referendum would be settled on the issue of migration. It would be the huge element of the campaigns. I'm sure it still will be an element of it. But I think, as Steve said, I think this point is starting to get across that you can't have your cake and eat it. And if you want access to the single market, that means accepting free movement of people. And as I said, I think the other important thing that could come out of this referendum campaign, this debate, is perhaps a greater understanding of the limits of what government can be expected to do on this issue, and the vast number of factors that drive things like migration, and perhaps a more sensible attitude might be the result if we can only be hopeful.
When you speak to the general public, they're concerned about low-skilled migration. I mean, so what do you think, what areas of migration would policymakers, public, do you think want to cut? What areas of reform do you think that they would want to see, or how would they want migration from the EU to change?
By restricting, or by having the freedom to restrict EU migration, you could have a non-discriminatory migration policy and therefore take more people from the rest of the world. But in an environment in which we're already accepting large numbers of people, and that those numbers still outnumber EU migrants, I wonder, is that politically sustainable? If the UK has voted to leave because because the public wants greater control of migration, that's not really an option either. So I guess you could start looking at yes, reducing lower skilled migration, but that means facing down employers who value these people. And again, I wonder how much freedom there would be to do that. I think you could end up in a situation in which you gave the illusion of greater control by saying, yes, this is done by work permits, but if the numbers don't change, the numbers don't change. So I wonder how much they would.
Well, I imagine that the focus would be on reducing the number of skilled workers. I mean, it would depend on whether we had a deal with the EU which covered in any way kind of long-term migration after Brexit, or whether we sort of gave up on that completely. Because it doesn't have to be a full free movement deal, you can have a kind of partial deal on special rules on highly skilled workers, and you certainly could have a deal also on visa waiver and things like that. So it would depend on whether we had that kind of deal. Because if you do have a deal with the EU on continued skilled workers at least coming backwards and forwards, then we might end up then giving them priority after all, but as part of the deal, and because of our trade-off, getting better access for our banks or something like that, it's somewhere else in the negotiations. So that could be the case. Or if we don't have any arrangement on long-term movement with anyone in the future coming from the EU, well, I imagine the focus is going to be saying we're going to have fewer skilled workers from the EU. Well, certainly fewer unskilled workers from the EU, and perhaps fewer skilled workers, but certainly kind of more open competition.
On access to benefits itself, well, clearly this is one of the most difficult elements of the negotiations. It's politically difficult and it's practically difficult in terms of coming up with a technical solution that everyone will be satisfied with. I do think that it is moving towards finding an agreement on this that will be acceptable to the UK government, and one that can be presented in the campaign as such. Because of the wider implication, I think it's become clear to other EU member states that this potentially could actually have an impact on the referendum result if the UK government is rebuffed on this completely.
Steve, I know that you have done some work around this issue, and you'll be aware that organisations like IPPR and Demos have talked about our migration support fund, where areas of the country that have had migration impacts have additional funding. And that doesn't seem to me to be very logical, given that the areas of the UK that actually need the investment, coastal towns and so on, actually areas with lowest migration. But I wonder whether you could say something about impact on services and public perceptions.
Yeah, there was a report yesterday by Eurofam, which is a foundation of the EU for living and working conditions, which does, I think, try and quantify for the first time the health issue, the health spending issue. And they suggest, it's an estimate, but they suggest that from the newer member states, there's less use of the public health system than the average, so less per capita use than the average, simply because people are younger. It's clear that the age profile is younger than the average for the population, the average for the older member states too. So that means less use of the health system now, because maybe in time they'll catch up, but for a decade or two to come. But that's not necessarily the case for education. They don't seem to have statistics for education, and they do speculate that there's pressure on schools, which I'm sure is the case because it's not just the numbers with schools, it's also trying to deal with people from a who don't speak English as a first language and having to spend extra time with them. So people who might have come from 2 or 3 years already in Poland and having to adjust to in the middle of the school system. So there's a series of different features to it. It is quite hard to quantify. It would make sense politically to set aside some money for an immigration response fund or something, like whatever you would want to call it, a public services dedicated fund that tries to address the public concerns about public services. Let's not kid ourselves that public services were fantastic before 2004, but I remember very clearly John Major coming to office and the Citizens' Charter and making a whole series of pledges on how quickly hip replacements would be done and so on, because people were waiting far longer for appointments and etc. At that time. And I certainly remember long waits for tubes and trains in the 1990s, well before the last 3 or 4 enlargements, indeed. The Commission was about to propose some changes to EU immigration legislation in December. They bumped it to March because they wanted to sort of correspond with the end of the negotiations, which didn't quite finish in December, of course. And that will cover things like export of child benefits, maybe some other benefits issues, and the issue which hasn't been mentioned put on the agenda by Cameron, which is posted workers, people going to another member state to work in construction or something like that for a brief period. Now, the current legislation, as the EU court has interpreted it, makes it somewhat easier for workers for employers to hire the workers on lower wage rates, and I imagine what the Commission will propose will be to make that harder. And I think that's an important factor in coming back to this question of low-paid workers being undercut by EU labour, because that would be directly addressing that concern.
And to expect people not to have concerns about the fact that their country is changing is also naive. Many of us think it's changed for the better, some think for the worse. That's a fact of life. So simply sort of bury our heads in the sand and say, look, immigration on aggregate is good for us, end of discussion, is really not a great way, I don't think, to engage people in these issues, especially when you've got a referendum coming, which, for the reasons we described earlier, migration has to be part of the conversation, because one of the elements of EU membership means accepting free movement of people.